A Small Town in Ukraine is a new book by Bernard Wasserstein. Decades ago, the historian Bernard Wasserstein set out to uncover the hidden past of the town 40 miles west of Lviv, where his family originated from. Krakowiec, and I hope I've got that right, is in the book. He recounts the dramatic and traumatic history. Delighted to be joining me live on the line, the author of A Small Town in Ukraine, Bernard Wasserstein. Bernard, good morning to you.
Good morning.
Thank you for joining us this morning. For those who aren't exactly sure whereabouts in Europe we're talking about, where is the town? And did I pronounce it correctly, more importantly?
Krakowiec is on the border of Ukraine and Poland. It's just inside Ukraine today. Although, in the course of the past 120 years or so, it's had no fewer than 9 changes of sovereignty, of ownership. So it's waltzed to and fro. Waltz is not quite the right word. It's been thrown to and fro among different powers over the years, but today it's just inside Ukraine,
and that is perhaps one of the legacies, or at least the hallmarks of middle-stroke Central European countries and areas, because there are marauding forces that go back and forth like an ebbing of a historical tide.
Well, that's true. Krakowiec is not unique in this respect. On the contrary, throughout Central and Eastern Europe, borders have been far from fixed over the centuries. Krakowiec itself has been the area where marauding armies, as you say, have come through again and again and again. There have been Russian armies, Turkish, Swedish, and in the 20th century, of course, the Red Army and the German army have come through. And in each case, these armies wrought great destruction, both to property and to lives in the area in general and to this town in particular.
And tell me a little bit about your own connection with the town itself. Was it your grandfather, your grandparents who originally come from this particular town?
That's right. My grandparents on my father's side were born in Krakowiec and died there.
So tell me about why you're deciding to write this book. I mean, Philippe Sands, who is a wonderful, is a human rights lawyer and has done some amazing work in terms of some of his media work as well. I mean, he once said Lviv, which is apparently is very close. He said that, a large amount of I think his wife famously said you could go to the cinema in Swiss Cottage and ask for anybody, Swiss Cottage in London, and ask if anybody had family from Lviv, and about half the people in the cinema seats would put their hands up, because it was one of the great centres, wasn't it? Up until the 30s.
Yes, well, in fact, my family used to live in Swiss Cottage. I lived there shortly after I was born.
Right.
Although my family moved away from there, as they moved away from Krakowiec. Krakowiec is about 40 kilometers west of the big city of Lviv. And it's a very small place. My father used to say it's a little place, you won't have heard of it, when people asked him where our family came from.
I'm sitting in a studio in southern Spain, and we were part of what was called Al-Andalus, the great Caliphate of Cordoba. And at that period, you had the three great religions living in sort of relative harmony. You were allowed to practice your faith whatsoever. And this particular town, I'm thinking about the Habsburg Empire, because the Habsburg seems to be an empire that's sort of been disregarded, or almost, people don't think about the Habsburg, but at the time of the Habsburg Empire, there were sort of several nationalities and religions coexisting relatively peacefully in the town itself.
Well, the Habsburg Empire, which ruled Krakowiec and the whole of the surrounding region between 1772 and the First World War, was a kind of umbrella under which a large number of different nationalities, ethnic groups, religions coexisted is not quite the right word. They were always jostling for position, jostling for power. And of course, with the rise of nationalism in the late 19th century, more and more the position of the Habsburg Empire, as of all empires, became increasingly precarious. In Krakowiec itself and in the surrounding region, there were three main population groups. There were Jews, who were the majority of the population in Krakowiec in the late 19th century. There were Ukrainians, also known as Ruthenians, who in this region were Greek Catholics by religion, and there were Poles who were Roman Catholics. And these three were always jostling amongst each other for position, for power, for influence. In particular, in the late 19th century, the Poles and the Ukrainians were increasingly disputing the right to dominance, and the Jews increasingly were caught in the middle.
And as always, because if you know your European history, we go back and back again with the fact that when nationalism breaks out, or when a people want to get together and pick on the other, going all the way back to the pogroms, going all the way back to the Crusades, almost, it always seems to be the Jewish population that is attacked, that is massacred.
Yes, the Jews in Krakowiec and in Galicia around it were not actually the victims of pogroms, unlike the Jews in the Russian Empire. To that extent, the Habsburg Empire can be seen as a relatively harmonious place. But the Jews, who were the main commercial element, they owned all the stores in the town. They lived around the central square, the market square. They were increasingly accused of price gouging and of exploiting the Christian population. My own family, my great-grandparents on one side were bakers, and my great-grandfather Jacob lived on one side of the market square. My other great-grandfather, Chaim Yitzchak, was an egg merchant. He exported eggs. As a matter of fact, he exported them as far away as England, remarkably, and they stayed fresh, allegedly, all that way. Actually, my great-grandfather, Chaim Yitzchak, wasn't the man who did that work. That was my great-grandmother, who went out to the market square on Thursdays every week and bought eggs from the local peasants who came into the town from the surrounding villages, and then they were packed and exported to Berlin or even to London. My great-grandfather, meanwhile, was at home studying the Talmud, the sacred Jewish works, as was the custom in those parts in those days.
So there was an outbreak of violence. So after 1914, you described it as 7 years of brutality and terror, if I recall.
That's right. The First World War found Krakowiec right in the heart of the fighting between the Central Powers, the Germans and the Austrians on one side and the Russians on the other. And the front lines moved to and fro across Krakowiec, and the Jews in particular were victims of persecution and suspicion by both sides, in particular by the Russians. So a large part of the Jewish population, including my own family, fled at that point to the interior of the Austrian Empire, and my my grandparents ended up in Berlin after the First World War. But then, in the late 1930s, when the Nazis seized power in Germany, my grandfather and later my grandmother and their daughter were expelled from Germany, as were all Polish citizens who were Jews living in Germany. They were expelled, 18,000 of them in a single night in October 1938, to Poland. And eventually my family went back to their birthplace. It was the only place that they could go. All other places were closed to them, to Krakowiec. And there they were caught by the outbreak of the Second World War in September 1939. So
what was the experience? I mean, we have documented this. We know the horrors, but what was the it's always very easy to write about the whole grand sweep of things, but one of the things about history is the fact that when you take the personal, how it affects different persons. Because it's easy to say, and I was talking to somebody about this, about the banality of evil, when somebody says, in Amsterdam, somebody was talking about the experience in Amsterdam, and a Nazi Dutch policeman wrote, and we rounded up 18,000 today and sent them on the railways, and that's in a sentence, it's done, and you never get the true horror. 1,800, excuse me. So for your grandparents, for your family, what was their experience and the outcome?
Well, in the first 2 years of the war, the eastern part of Poland was in fact occupied by the Soviet Union under an agreement between Stalin and Hitler just before the outbreak of World War II. Poland was divvied up. The western two-thirds of Poland was occupied by Nazi Germany and the eastern third by the Soviet Union. And Krakowiec fell just inside the area occupied by the Soviet Union. So until June 1941, my family lived under Soviet occupation. That was hardly pleasant because the Soviets deported many people to the eastern part of the Soviet Union, and they didn't allow small businesses such as my family's to continue. They didn't allow really free religious practice, but at least people survived. But then in June 1941, Hitler attacked the Soviet Union. And on the first day of that war, Krakowiec, which was just on the borderline, was overwhelmed by the Wehrmacht, by the German army. The Soviet soldiers fled in their underpants, according to witnesses. And so Krakowiec, until mid-1944, was under German occupation. And in 1943, nearly the entire Jewish population was massacred by the Nazis. My own family, miraculously, were able to survive for a time because they were sheltered by a local Ukrainian in a small hut on the edge of the town, and they somehow managed to survive there until shortly before the Red Army arrived in July 1944. But in the spring of 1944, they were betrayed. They were betrayed by the very man who had sheltered them. And one of the questions I raise in my book is why a man who had sheltered them for more than a year should have chosen to betray them in the end. Anyway, he did betray them. And my grandfather, my grandmother, and their daughter, a teenage girl, were shot in the town. They had to dig their own graves. My father, even more miraculously, my father, their son, managed to escape. He had not been forced to go back to Krakowiec from Germany, he had managed to get out to Italy in the summer of 1939. Italy, although it was an ally of Germany, did not enter the war on the side of Germany immediately in September 1939. And so for the first year of the war, my father, still a teenager, aged 17, still a schoolboy, was able to live in Rome relatively freely. In the summer of 1939, though, in the summer of 1940, though, when France fell to the Germans, and after the British withdrawal from Dunkirk, it became clear that Italy was going to enter the war. And so my father desperately looked for a place to get out of Italy. Well, it wasn't so easy because country after country was closing its borders to refugees. The only place that it seemed he might be able to get to was Turkey, which was neutral at the time. But in order to get there, he needed to show a valid passport. Now, he had a Polish passport, but in order to be valid, that required a stamp, a sort of authentication by the local Polish consulate in Rome. So my father went along to the Polish consulate and said, could he have this stamp? And he was thrown out of the building unceremoniously. And so he was stuck there, and it was clear that Italy was about to enter the war, and then it would be impossible to get out. But then something very extraordinary happened. My father was living in a lodging house, and he had a friend there who was a painter. And this chap was employed for a time in restoring frescoes in the headquarters of the Jesuit order in the Vatican. And this chap said to my father, look, it so happens I'm working in the office of the head of the Jesuit order, the so-called Black Pope, and he happens to be a Polish citizen. And maybe if you talked to him, he could help you. Well, my father was very dubious, but he thought there was nothing to lose. So he went along with this chap, and this chap got him into the building under some pretext and into the office of the Jesuit, the Father General, as it's called, of the Jesuit order. And my father explained his predicament and asked him whether he might be able to help him to get this Polish authentication from the consulate. And the Jesuit looked at him, his name was Leduchowski, and he said, how come it is that if you claim to be Polish, you don't speak a word of the Polish language? So my father explained that although he was born in Germany, he had not been granted German citizenship, so he was still a Pole. But his parents came from Poland. So the Jesuit said to him, "Oh yes, and where in Poland do they come from?" So my father gave his usual answer. He said, "Oh, it's a little place. You won't have heard of it." So the Jesuit said to him, "What is the name of the place?" So my father said, "Krakowiec." And he pronounced it correctly, which is difficult for foreigners to do. So the moment he said that, the Jesuit turned to his secretary, a young priest, and just gestured to him. And the priest took my father out of the building, and my father thought he was being thrown out. But in fact, the priest took him along to the Polish consulate, where my father said that thanks to the fact that this priest was accompanying him, he was received as if he himself were a prince of the church. And he was immediately given the stamp, and a couple of days later, he was on a boat on his way to Turkey. Now, why did the Jesuit Father General do that? It turned out that Leduchowski was a member of a family that had been the chief landowners in Krakowiec for many decades. And he had happy memories of spending his childhood at the family estate in Krakowiec. So the moment my father said, Krakowiec, it was like a shibboleth in the biblical sense of that term. It immediately authenticated everything my father was saying, and it stirred the Jesuit to act on my father's behalf. And so off he went to Turkey. So he was the only member, in fact, of my family who survived.
With the correct pronunciation of the town, and therefore incredible, absolutely incredible. How did you trace?
There's remarkable
more.
coda.
Good grief! Okay, there's a remarkable coda. I'm just left stunned by that, what you just told me. But please.
Well, there's a remarkable coda to this story. My father had relatives in South Africa who had emigrated there from Krakowiec. They had helped my father by sending him enough money to survive in Rome during that year that he was stuck there. After the war, long after the war, my father was visiting Krakowiec. Was visiting Johannesburg in South Africa. This was in about the 1970s. And he went to a party at my great uncle's home. And there he was introduced to a Pole. And he was introduced to him, and the man's name was Count Ledochowski. Now, my father said, well, that's amazing. And then he told this man the story of how he'd got out of Rome. And Ledochowski said, yes, I am the nephew of the man who saved your life, in effect. And extraordinarily, the reason that I'm here in South Africa is that your relatives, your uncles, helped me when I was exiled from Poland after the war, because I had fought in the Polish resistance against the Nazis and against the communists. All our lands were taken away from my family. I ended up in Central Africa, and your family helped me establish myself here in South Africa in a business. And so, in a way, there was a kind of poetic justice here, that you were saved by my family, and I was helped after the war by your family, and neither knew of the other's existence.
That is, as you say, indeed, that is a coda, and then some in modern parlance, and yet here we are in 2023, and we see the lands being fought over again, and that small town that nobody would have ever heard of before finds itself again embroiled in conflict.
Yes, it's been the place just on the border where tens of thousands of refugees from Ukraine have fled from the fighting, from the Russian invasion, to the safety of Poland over the past year and a bit. 94 young men from Krakowiec, a small town of nowadays maybe just 1,000 people, 94 have been called up to fight in the Ukrainian army. 6 have been killed. And 4, I think, have been captured by the Soviets. One wonders what their fate will be.
What do you hope that people will recognize, will discover from your book, from your history?
Well, I'm a bit dubious about lessons of history, but I do hope that when people read my book, they will take away some appreciation of humanity, of human nature for good and human nature for evil, because both are shown in this book, and in some cases, both are shown within the same person. As I say, the same person who protected my family in Krakowiec also betrayed them. So there are sparks of humanity, of good in people that one can see in this book, and also the opposite. And so I hope they will recognize in this book and in themselves those competing sparks.
The book is called A Small Town in Ukraine. It's called The Place We Came From, The Place We Went Back To. Any Is it an aim to return there then, or was he talking about again
I did return. I returned for the first time in 1993, and I've been back twice since then. I was welcomed by the local population, and I had cordial discussions with them, and I learned a lot from interviews with the people in the town. My latest visit in 2019 was with my wife and my teenage son. And I was hoping, and I think he did, I was hoping that he would learn something about his family and about his origins from that visit. And as I say, I think he did.
The book is called A Small Town in Ukraine, The Place We Came From, The Place We Went Back To. It's by Bernard Wasserstein, who I've been speaking to today. If people want to find you, do you have a website? Can people find you online, or where's the best place to...
If they can spell my name, Wasserstein, Wasserstein, then they can find me very easily on my webpage at the University of Chicago, where I am an emeritus professor, which means I'm a retired professor. They can also find me on the Penguin Books website, where they can also find details about this book.
And the book is also available as a virtual download from our own virtual bookstore. The book is called A Small Town in Ukraine, The Place We Came From, The Place We Went Back To. It's by Bernard Wasserstein. Bernard, thank you so much for your time today.
Hasta la vista.
Indeed. Thank you. Thank you very much.